Today, you will learn about the most important endgame of them all, as put by none other than Mark Dvoretsky, legendary chess coach of the Soviet and later Russian chess school. They arise the most often as the minor pieces and the queen get quickly into the game, hence they are more likely to be traded off, leaving us with a rook endgame. If this video gets 25 likes within next Tuesday, there will be a part 2. With Master Noam Wittenberg, back with the weekly upload. I stream 4 times a week on Twitch Tuesday and Thursday, 19 o'clock Central European Time, 11 o'clock Central European Time, Saturday and Sunday. Check it out, links in the description below. We'll start with one of the most fundamental rook endgames, analyzed by Philidor back in '77, namely the Philidor position. He's a chess legend of the far past who's well known for saying pawns are the soul of chess. In this position, black has a very simple way to make a draw on the spot. Now, how does black do this? If you don't know, stop the video for 11 seconds and try and figure it out. Black can go rook a6 in this position. This cuts off the white king on the 6th rank, so white cannot go on the 6th rank with the king. These moves are now illegal. There is only one way for white to progress in this position. It's to push the pawn to e6. The idea is to go king f6 by white, after which there will be a nasty threat of checkmate with rook b8. This is best to avoid by black, so black plays rook a1 in this position. Rook a2 and rook a3 are also possible alternatives, but rook a1 is the most professional move, as the rook is keeping the longest possible distance to the opponent's king. This becomes relevant in some positions, as it takes a longer period of time for the opponent's king to attack the rook. So rook a1, and now if king f6, trying to deliver a checkmate on b8, black simply gives a check to the white king, and white is not able to make any progress in this position. Let's go on to the next example. What if white has been able to go king f6 in this position? Is it still a draw? Well, Philidor believed that this position is in fact winning for white, giving the following line: rook f1 check, king e6, threatening a checkmate, king f8, rook a8 check, king g7, king e7, rook b1, e6, rook b7, king d6, rook b6, king d7, rook b7, king c6, and in this position the black rook has unfortunately run out of checks. It turns out that regardless of where it now moves to, be to the e7 square or to the b1 square, after rook e7 there is coming king d6 attacking the black rook. The black rook is obligated to move, as king f6 trying to defend the black rook is met with rook f8, giving a check to the black king, forcing it to move, and then taking on e7 with the king. So king d6, and after the rook moves to b7, there is coming e7 in this position. The white king on d6 supports the e7 pawn, and there is nothing preventing the white pawn from queening next move with e8 queen. After rook b1, we get a similar situation with e7, and there is nothing to stop e8 queen from taking place next move, when white will be winning. So rook e1 is in fact a way to save the draw. So the objective evaluation of this position is draw. So if king e6, white tries the exact same thing, which of the squares would you go to with the black king? It's rather evident that white is threatening a checkmate on a8 in this position, and black can choose to parry this checkmate with either king d8 or king f8, which is the correct option. Alright, king f8 is the best move. The king is going to the short side, and the rook is going to the long side. Rook a8, king g7, rook a7 is an option, then king g6, removing the king to another square, though perhaps a more critical try is king d6, intending to go e6, e7 in this position and later promoting the e-pawn. What's black's only move in this position not to lose? Alright, it's king f7. Black takes control over the e6 square, so e6 is not possible any longer in this position, as after e6 there would be rook takes e6, regaining white's pawn. Let us move on to the next example. In this rook endgame, the same question arises: is black able to obtain a draw by attacking white's pawn from behind with the move rook g1? Well, let's find out. So then white will likely go, so white can go rook a6, threaten a checkmate on a8. Now black has two options. Let's begin with rook f1, one of the ways to prevent checkmate. Unfortunately this loses, however, after rook a8. Rook f8, rook takes f8, king takes f8, king h7, and there is nothing stopping the white pawn from promoting. However, what about king f8 in this position? White has a nice idea here, rook a8, king e7, and then there is coming rook g8, defending the pawn on g5 additionally with the rook. The idea now is that white wants to go king h7, push g6, move away the rook, then go g7, king g8, and obtain the Lucena position. Unfortunately, there is nothing that black can do against it. And these moves could be played, for instance. This is the Lucena position. A funny fact that most chess players do not know is that this position was not included in Lucena's book on chess in 1497, but this position rather made its first appearance in Alessandro Salvio's book in 1634. Let us see how to convert this position as white. So after rook g1, white will swing over the rook, deliver a check on the black monarch. Now after king f6, white simply goes king f8, and there's nothing stopping the pawn from promoting to g8 next move. If rook takes g7 trying to take the pawn, there is coming rook f2 check. Now the only way to move the king so that it still defends the rook on g7 is king g6. Unfortunately, the white delivers the skewer rook g2, threatening the king, and after the king moves, white will be able to gobble up the rook on g7 and will be up an additional rook with an easily winning position. So perhaps more critical is king d7. Do you know the mechanism that wins here for white if you don't stop the video for 5 seconds and find it? Alright, in this position there is the move rook e4. And it turns out that after black's rook will move to h3, let's say, or g1, any other square, white's plan is still rather clear. White now advances the monarch. And it turns out that white will use the rook on e4 to give the king shelter from the checks generated by the f3 rook. So rook g3, king f6. Now if rook f3, there is coming king g5. Only way to stop the pawn from promoting is rook g3. And then there will come rook g4, successfully blocking the black rook, and the pawn on g7 will decide the game. Black could also try rook g1, but then white rebuilds what we call the bridge by going rook e5 in this position, and there is nothing stopping white from going rook g5 next move, and then white's pawn on g7 will promote and decide the game in white's favor. Let's go on to the next rook endgame position you need to know. In this position, evaluate it please. Is it winning or is it a draw? Winning for white. Alright, it turns out that it's in fact not possible to make progress here with the white pieces. If the rook moves, then the pawn on a7 will be captured, and king and rook against king and rook is a draw. And if white attempts to get their king over to b6, let's see what will happen. Black will simply start delivering checks with the rook, and there's no way for white to escape the checks as well as defend the pawn on a7 with the king. The only danger here to keep in mind is that black's king must never leave the g7 or h7 squares, or else there will be some serious consequences. After king f7 there will come, in this position, rook h8. And it turns out that white wants to promote their pawn, and if black takes the pawn on a7, trying to take it before it promotes, there is coming rook h7, an attack on the king, and after the king moves, the rook on a7 will drop. Hence, black cannot go king f7. What about king g6 or king f6 or king h6? They're met with a very similar idea. Now a check along the a flank is no longer allowing the black king to attack the rook, as for instance in this position, if rook g8, then simply king takes g8, The rook is under attack and the a8 square is covered by the rook on a1. However, after king g6, rook g8 in this position, the king is no longer attacking the rook, and after the king moves, the pawn will promote, and white will be the victor of this game. And now, I'm leaving you all with a question. What's the evaluation of this position? We see a slight difference from the previous position, that there is a pawn on a6 rather than on a7. Is it still a draw in this position, or is white now able to win this position? Alright, you've now learned about one of the most important endgames in chess. If you made it this far in the video, why not subscribe, like and share the video, and I will see you next Tuesday.